Hey guys, it's Christian, and today I'm gonna show you AdGuard Home, the powerful alternative to Pi-hole that many of you have been asking me about in the comments of my last Pi-hole tutorial. And honestly, after testing both solutions in my home lab, I've gotta say AdGuard Home has probably the more impressive features that might make you reconsider your DNS blocking setup. No, don't get me wrong, Pi-hole is still fantastic. It is an awesome network-wide ad blocker that works on all of your devices, all of your computers, your phones, your tablets, even smart TVs without installing any application on them, and it effectively blocks ads and trackers right at the DNS level, which means they never reach your devices in the first place. But here's the thing, AdGuard Home does all of that, and it even takes it a step further. For example, it has built-in DNS-over-HTTPS and DNS-over-TLS support right out of the box, which encrypts all of your DNS queries so that your ISP can't snoop on your browsing activity. But before we dive into all of the technical details, I need to clear up something right important, because I know it confuses a lot of people, and it certainly also confused me in the beginning. AdGuard Home is not the same as AdGuard. AdGuard without the home is a commercial browser extension, but AdGuard Home that we're talking about today is a completely free and open source application, just like Pi-hole. So there's no premium version, no paid features, no subscription. Everything I'm showing you is 100% free, and the source code is also available on GitHub for anyone to inspect. So in this video, I'm going to show you how to deploy this thing on a Docker host. I'm going to show you how to set up all the magic DNS-over-HTTPS encryption, both to upstream servers and also in your local network. So I hope you're ready for it. But before we start, let me also quickly talk about my absolute favorite tool for remote access called TwinGate, the sponsor of today's video. Because TwinGate is always my first choice when I need to log into my home servers over SSH, or when I need to access any administrative web interfaces, because TwinGate is a secure, fast and super simple solution. It's what we call ZTNA in tech, a Zero Trust Network Access platform that establishes secure connections between all of your devices. So every connection always have to be verified and authorized, otherwise TwinGate won't let the request go through. And this technology is super amazing. It even works through NAT devices and firewalls without any port forwarding or firewall exceptions required, so you can just securely log into all of your devices at home, no matter where you are or where you're connecting from. If you would like to try it out, then check out my tutorials on how to install TwinGate in your network and how to integrate this into your Docker, Kubernetes or DevOps environment using Terraform. It is super cool and also completely free with up to 5 users and connects to 10 different remote networks. So start making your network more secure and accessible with TwinGate. Of course, I'll drop you a link to their website in the description box down below. Alright, but now let's get started with the main topic of the video, AdGuard Home and DNS or network-wide ad blocking. So first of all, this is the website of AdGuard Home. As I said, it is part of the AdGuard family, but it is a completely free and open source product. You can even scroll down here to find the GitHub repository. This will take you to the source code, and there you will also find some installation instructions or tutorials on how to set this thing up. Now, AdGuard offers a bunch of different installation methods. Yeah, there is an automated install on Linux, macOS, FreeBSD, OpenBSD. So that basically runs a simple bash installation script and guide you through the setup. But of course, as most of us home lab nerds want to have a little more control over the setup, I know that most of you probably will prefer the installation of a Docker container. That's also my preferred choice because it is super simple and easy to set this up. So that also comes with a few simple commands that you basically can just copy and paste to your Docker host. But of course, if you're following all of my other installation tutorials, you probably will know that I most likely prefer a Docker Compose file that you can easily copy paste and also customize. To create this Docker Compose file, we of course will use my famous boilerplate CLI tool. So that is a simple script that I've created to share all of my deployment and configuration and DevOps templates with you. So here on this GitHub repository, you can find the source code of the CLI app as well as all of my templates, not just for AdGuard, but for any other applications. Just take a look. You can install this CLI tool with also one simple command, paste it in the terminal, and that then runs the installation. Once that is done, you can easily just run the boilerplates command in your terminal. First of all, you always should make a repo update. So this pulls down all of the latest updates of my GitHub repository library so that you have the latest and greatest versions of the templates. Also, don't forget to update the boilerplate CLI tool itself from time to time. Because in the last versions, I fixed some critical bugs. To update the CLI tool itself, just run this simple one-line installation script again that will always update to the latest version. All right, so once you have that, let's execute boilerplate's compose list. So this will give you a list of all of the templates that you have pulled down from my GitHub repository. Here you will find templates for all these applications, and I just recently added a new template for AdGuard Home. To show the details of this boilerplate, just use the compose show command, followed by the unique identifier of this boilerplate, and this will give you some installation instructions, such as the descriptions, some prerequisites, so things that you actually should be aware of before deploying this, and some references to the official projects, as well as the template file structure. So it's basically just a simple compose.yaml file. There's everything in here, and you can even customize this compose YAML file by setting some variables to change the port exposures, maybe add a separate volume mount point, and you can even automatically install the Traefik labels. So this will later be super important for local DNS-over-TLS encryption, because this requires trusted TLS certificates. By using a Traefik reverse proxy, you can easily obtain them from Let's Encrypt completely for free, and they auto-renew. Now, if you don't know what Traefik is, you definitely should watch my other Traefik tutorial. Link is also in the description. Now, let me just generate a super simple Docker Compose boilerplate for AdGuard Home. You just use the boilerplate's compose generate command, followed by the ID of the boilerplate you want to generate. And then you can set some parameters, like with a -v, you can modify these variables. For example, if you want to enable Traefik, you just put in the name of the variable, enabled equal true. And this will then change some other dependencies for this variable as well. But you can also use the guided settings to walk you through setting and customizing all these variables as well. I will show you both ways. I think that might be pretty useful. By the way, these compose templates are usually generated in the directory where you're currently located. It will create a new directory that has the name of the boilerplate ID. If you want to save this to a different location, just use the -o parameter. For example, let's put this in a temporary directory under AdGuard Home, and it will ask you to customize any settings. If you say no, it will generate them with all the default values, but if you say yes, it will guide you through setting all these variables manually. So here the service name is a required variable. It's by default set to AdGuard Home. If you don't want to customize anything, you want the default value, just hit enter. It will automatically load this. The container restart policy to unless stopped, I think that's also fine. Now here I've also added a separate initial setup wizard on port 3000. Now this is later important, it's mentioned here in the prerequisites. So during the initial setup, AdGuard Home runs a separate HTTP server on port 3000 to guide you through the configuration. This is unencrypted, so you definitely should be careful when you're connecting to a remote AdGuard Home to set this thing up. You probably should do this in a protected network. But this is only relevant for the initial setup. Once you have completed the setup, it will close the port 3000 and it won't be accessible anymore. With a no, you can regenerate the boilerplate and disable the setting, but of course we want to say yes and follow the initial setup. The Docker network mode. Now this is also quite important for the DHCP functionality. It's similar to Pi-hole. I've explained it there, but if you want to get more details, we will talk about this in a second. Also for the ports, of course, we want to use port 80. That's the HTTP port. This probably is not relevant if you're using Traefik anyways, but yeah, I will talk about this later. Here you can customize the volume storage. By default, I always use local Docker volumes. I think this is the best way to do it. But if you prefer a mount point or an NFS volume, you can also configure this. Now, here we want to configure the Traefik reverse proxy integration. So this basically just adds labels to the Docker Compose file that are relevant for the Traefik reverse proxy. Again, if you don't know what that is, you probably just continue with no, and you would then have to connect to the actual HTTP or HTTPS port directly. But if you're using Traefik like me, I think this is the best way to obtain trusted TLS certificates for any containerized applications, which is also super important for DNS over HTTPS later. So I certainly would recommend you to do this. If you want to customize the Traefik proxy network name, you can do it in here. And then you need to specify the subdomain. I want to set this to AdGuard Home. I think that's fine. And the base domain name you can customize to your home lab domain that you're using internally. You probably know this when you're using Traefik anyway, so I want to set this to server test 1, so that's where I'm deploying AdGuard Home later. Now, of course, I also want to enable HTTPS or TLS management for the Traefik certificates, so that means that Traefik will obtain the trusted TLS certificates from Let's Encrypt automatically for the AdGuard container by using my Cloudflare certificate resolver. That's using the DNS challenge. I've configured this all on my Traefik reverse proxy, and now this has generated successfully the AdGuard Home compose file. So let's take a closer look at this compose file. It is using 2 volumes here, one for the configuration file, one for the data. It added all the necessary capabilities, and as I just told you, the Traefik labels to automatically obtain TLS certificates for this application, connected this to the external Traefik proxy network, and that's basically everything. So let me just copy this to my test server. I think I've made a small typo in the directory, so that was a bit confusing at first, but it's actually not that important. So let's copy this to server test1 home.crave.de, and then let's open a new connection to this. So here you can see on this server, I'm already running a bunch of different containers. Here's also the Traefik reverse proxy running. So that is great. We can now basically go AdGuard Home directory. Here's the compose file, and run a simple docker compose up-d. Okay, so normally I would just connect using AdguardHome.server-test1.home.cl-creative.de, but this will not work yet because we have not finished the initial setup. So if you need to do this, you need to remove the S from the HTTPS protocol because it's using an unencrypted connection on port 3000. And this is the installation wizard. Okay, so before my eyes are bleeding, let's turn on dark mode. Luckily, it has a light and a dark mode theme, so that's great. And let's just go through the initial setup. Yeah, we will do another deployment in a second, but I will just walk you through everything. So if you're using this inside a Docker container, you will most likely just have the internal interface of the Docker container and not your real interface on your host system, which actually doesn't really matter. So just listen on all interfaces. The same for DNS server, but in theory, you could customize these things. But if it's running in the Docker container, probably don't touch this. Now you need to set up a username and a password. I will just pick something super simple. And that's it, right? That's the initial setup. Now it guides you through the setup, how you can set up your router, your Windows, Mac. We will talk about this in a minute. So let's just go to next and open the dashboard. So now it's automatically redirecting us to HTTPS and then the real domain, not on port 3000. The port 3000 is now not accessible anymore. And if you're using Traefik, you should also see that the connection is secure because you are using trusted TLS certificates. All right, so let's now log in. This is the web admin dashboard of AdGuard Home. Okay, so one thing that I also explained in my Pi-hole tutorial, if you're not using Traefik or you want to deploy AdGuard Home on a server that already has an HTTP or DNS server running, you might want to follow a different deployment. So that's the reason why I've created the boilerplates in a way where you can configure the network mode. For example, if you want to give the AdGuard Home container a completely separate IP address, because that's what you want to use for your primary DNS server, or maybe you need DHCP functionality, so then you need to set the network mode to host or macvlan. Now, I personally don't like this setup because in this setup, you cannot easily use Traefik, you cannot use trusted TLS certificates, and that kind of makes the DNS-over-HTTPS functionality, at least in your local network, completely useless. However, you could also make the argument that this is actually not that important, and for simplicity, you might just prefer using a macvlan mode instead of complicated Traefik reverse proxy, whatever. So if you want a super simple setup without all these TLS certificate mess and you just want to get this working for testing or whatever, you can generate a new deployment. I'm gonna set a few variables here. So you can do this through the guided wizard, or you can set parameters. It's depending on what you like most. I will just show you the other method so I can show you how the tool is working. For example, if we set the network mode to macvlan, now this requires you to set up these other parameters, for example, the IP address. So then you can give this container a completely separate IP address on your local network. For example, I don't know, 24 99, yeah. The parent interface is whatever is the primary network interface of where you want to deploy this on your real host server. I usually set this to ETH0. That's at least on my physical machine the case. Then, of course, you also need to define a subnet. In my case, it is this one. But if you're using a 24 subnet mask, your IP addresses will likely look a bit different. And you also need to specify a gateway. So this is the IP address of the router of this network. By default, Traefik is disabled. So note on this setup, I will not enable Traefik reverse proxy. Do you want to customize any settings? I say no, because I've set all the variables in my initial command via parameters. And let's also take a look at this file. Now you can see the Traefik labels are completely gone because this is not relevant anymore. And the port exposures are also completely gone because when you're using macvlan, the container is automatically always accessible with all the services that the application uses on that IP address. You can even deploy this side by side, the other container if you want. So for example, let's also copy the second deployment to my server, docker compose up-d. Because it's using a completely different IP address, it doesn't generate any conflict with the port bindings. So I can just connect to this IP address. I just can't remember which one we used. We used this one. Yeah, okay. So let's copy this. Let's put it here, port 3000, and that's it. Here we are again. No, we could set up this as well. No, again, this by default doesn't have HTTPS, doesn't have any certificates. Yeah, so it's an unencrypted connection, which is not ideal in my opinion. All right, so now that's enough for the installation setup. I know I sometimes take a little more time to go through the setups and deployments, but because I think this is super important to deploy this in the right way, because it later makes such a huge difference how you can set up DNS over HTTPS. I wanted to go in a lot of detail through this here. But anyway, so let's assume you have used the Traefik reverse proxy. Like I told you, you have trusted TLS certificates on your web interface. You're not using a separate macvlan. Then you have a great production-ready setup for AdGuard Home that you can use in your local network or maybe anywhere else. Now, why do I make such a big deal about this? Why is AdGuard Home even better than Pi-hole? So many features are quite similar to Pi-hole. Yeah, on the dashboard you see the total DNS queries. You see the blocked domains by the filters, blocked malware and phishing. You see all the top clients that make DNS requests to your system. You see the top query domains, block domains, and whatnot. So dashboard is super simple, super clean. In my opinion, AdGuard Home has in many places a little more intuitive and more cleaner design than Pi-hole. Pi-hole seems a little old legacy and sometimes not really intuitive what the different menus are meaning. So here I like this a lot more, honestly. Now the block lists are also kind of similar to Pi-hole. Default Pi-hole lists are using the Stephen Black list, which is a community blacklist. Here you can see all the domain names that it contains, and it contains about like 80,000 entries, which is a lot, and it's great that it's community maintained. However, when we go to the AdGuard system, you can see it's a lot more. And when you click on this, you can see an important difference because the AdGuard Home DNS filter does not just support plain domain names, it's also supporting URL path blocking. Plus, AdGuard uses their own filtering lists, which come from their browser ad blocker extensions, yeah. And it is, in general, more comprehensive coverage. So this is, in my opinion, a big plus for AdGuard Home. And what is also super cool, if you go to the settings and go to DNS settings, you can see that it automatically configures DNS upstream servers, so where the DNS requests are forwarded to. And this uses by default Quad 9, which is a non-profit organization for managing DNS queries. And the important difference here is that you see the HTTPS protocol in front of that. So that means AdGuard Home is by default using built-in DoH support, DNS-over-HTTPS, which means all the DNS requests are getting encrypted. We will later talk about some of the technical details about this and why this is such a big deal. And what is also a big plus that is not possible in Pi-hole, you can even add per client configuration block lists and settings. So this is a little hidden under client settings. So here you can add persistent clients by using an IP address or MAC address filtering. And then you can enabled or disabled certain settings for just that specific device. And you can even set other upstream servers or block specific services. So this is also super cool. I will show you that in a different menu, but you can set this up globally or per client. So this lets you block pre-configured services like ChatGPT, Claude, so AI services, dating websites. If you want to prevent your wife from opening the Tinder app, for example, you can just enable this. Or you can block gambling sites, gaming, web hosting. So there's so much in here. Social networks, yeah, this is really cool. So you can very easily block specific services, maybe for your children, yeah. It also has some parental control features. So in my opinion, this is just a much, much better feature set compared to Pi-hole. And you can also manage custom DNS records. This is by using DNS rewrites. So here you can add a new rewrite, for example, to send a query to a specific domain, which is super cool. For example, anything that goes to home.creative.de, I want to send to my local DNS server instead of routing this to the internet. So I know, a long introduction, but honestly, I think AdGuard Home is super great. Thank you so much for anybody who recommended this in the comments, because I actually didn't know that this was existing, but it's really nice. But now that this is running, you might wonder, how do you actually configure your devices to start using this? So that's the next critical step, because currently this is just sitting there and ready to work, but it's not actually processing anything, because it doesn't receive automatically any queries from your network. You have to tell all of your devices, hey, for DNS resolving, don't ask Cloudflare or your ISP DNS server, just send everything to AdGuard Home, and this is then doing the filtering and all of that stuff. So according to the AdGuard's documentation, there are two recommended approaches for configuring your network to use AdGuard. Your option 1 is to configure your router or DHCP server, which is the recommended way. And the option 2 is to configure individual devices. Of course, individual devices is always a lot of work, so that's why I'm not explaining it. It doesn't actually make sense. You simply just configure your home router, whatever device it is, configure your DHCP server settings to send a DNS server configuration to all of your devices. So then when a client is connecting to your home router and asking for an IP address via DHCP configuration, the home router will send the DNS server, which you configure to the IP address of the AdGuard Home server, to the client, and then the client can make a DNS request to AdGuard Home. Now, this is super easy. It doesn't require any additional configuration on your devices. Yeah, in my example, I'm using an OpenSense firewall that I also made a video about. So here I just go to my services, go to IC DHCP, and then just go to DNS servers and set the IP address of the server where AdGuard Home is running. So just to test how that would work, if you want to do an NS lookup, maybe on tinder.com, yeah. Don't think that I'm actually on this website. I'm just using this as a simple example, yeah. So if you send a DNS query, you get an answer from your AdGuard Home server. And when we do a refresh, you should see the DNS query popping up here in that list here. And you can also go in the query log to see what it is. Now let's try out the filtering, because I don't want anybody to open the Tinder's website, so I can click on blocking services, and I can save this. Now when I do another DNS request, you see I get back an IP address 000, which is the black hole redirection, so basically to nowhere, and then my client device cannot resolve the real IP address of the Tinder's server. And then you also see in the query log that this here is blocked. By the way, the query log also allows you to search for something, yeah, specific IP addresses or names. It is super easy and super cool. I really like this a lot. But yeah, that is just a normal DNS query. Now, if you want to have a little more protection for your DNS queries, as I said in the beginning, AdGuard Home is by default using a DNS-over-HTTPS encryption. This is honestly the most powerful feature of AdGuard Home. And this is where it really shines in comparison to Pi-hole. So let's dive a little deeper into this. First of all, let me explain what these technologies are and why they matter. So traditionally, DNS queries are always sent in plain text over the internet on port 53. Anyone in between you and the DNS server, your ISP, your mobile carrier, even some random person on the Wi-Fi network you're on, can exactly see what domains you're looking up. Yeah? And this is, of course, a huge privacy problem. When your ISP can look up all of your requests, it can basically build a complete profile on your browsing habits just by watching the DNS queries. It doesn't need to encrypt the connection between the browser and the real web server. It can just do that by the DNS queries. So they can literally see every website you visit, when you visit it, how often you visit it, and so on. Now, that's why we came up with DNS-over-HTTPS or DNS-over-TLS to solve this problem by just encrypting DNS queries. Now, it's important to understand the difference between the two. DNS-over-TLS DoT wraps all the DNS queries in TLS encryption, typically on a separate port, 853, which is a dedicated port just for encrypted DNS. And there's also DNS-over-HTTPS DoH, which sends the DNS queries just over the normal HTTPS port 443, which is the same one that is as used for secure web browsing, which makes it effectively harder to block or detect because you cannot distinguish the DNS queries from other real browsing activity. So both technologies provide encryption, but DoH has become the more popular choice because of that reason. It's also important to say that there are two places where DNS encryption can happen, and they serve different purposes. The scenario one is this here. This is the default. When you configure AdGuard Home in your home lab, and you configured your router to send your client via DHCP a different IP for the DNS server, your client will still make a plain unencrypted DNS lookup to the AdGuard Home server on port 53, but then the AdGuard Home will send this to the upstream server by using DNS-over-HTTPS on port 443. So that means your ISP in between cannot distinguish that traffic from real browsing activity. It's just seeing, oh, there is a new HTTPS connection on port 443 to the Cloudflare server, but they don't really see what DNS query you are making. Now, this, of course, is by default out of the box a super secure setup. However, you can even take that a step further by also encrypting the local DNS queries over HTTPS. So that means your client will not send the DNS queries in plain text to AdGuard Home. You can also send them over the HTTP port. And when you're using AdGuard Home in combination with a Traefik reverse proxy, you can also use the trusted TLS certificates on the port 443 and just send the DNS requests to that Traefik reverse proxy. It will forward it to AdGuard Home. From there, it goes to the upstream DNS servers. So the entire connection from your local device over your local network to your AdGuard Home, and from there is completely encrypted, which is really great, and in my opinion, the most secure setup. And now, if you go to the settings here, if you want to enable this, you need to go to Settings, Encryption Settings, and Enable Encryption here. However, there's a small problem that I encountered. You cannot really save this configuration because it's asking you for a certificate. And this is because by default, the AdGuard Home server would normally understand that this is the terminating connection. So it doesn't know that there is a Traefik reverse proxy in front of it. And usually you would have to send the DNS queries to the HTTPS port of the AdGuard Home server, and the AdGuard Home server would terminate the TLS connection with a trusted TLS certificate that you need to somehow obtain, upload to the AdGuard Home server, and put in the path here with the private key. Now, this, of course, was a bit of a bummer when I saw it the first time, but luckily I found a way to overcome this. But it's a little hidden. You don't find it in the menu. Yeah, you just leave on the defaults, and you need to go into the main configuration YAML file of AdGuard Home. So this you can easily do by just going to the server where you have deployed AdGuard Home, and then run a super simple temporary container. For example, the netshoot container. This is a utility container that comes with a lot of network tools, but it also has a Vim editor and a Nano editor on board, and it's super simple, efficient container where you can just hook into a container, automatically mount the volumes from an existing container, and open a bash shell. Probably I need to use a different name here because I made a typo in the beginning of this tutorial. Alright, anyway, so I will just replace it with this here, and then it will work. So now we are inside the AdGuard Home container, and if you go into the /opt AdguardHome conf directory, you will find the main AdguardHome.yaml file. If you open this, you'll see this is the entire configuration of your system, and there are two sections that are really important. There is a TLS section where you need to enable TLS, and then there is a setting that is called allow unencrypted DoH. Set this to true. So then the Traefik reverse proxy will receive the DNS query, and it will send it to the port 80 of your AdGuard Home server. And by setting this, it will accept it. Now there's one other problem that I saw in the logs of the queries. You will not see the real client IP address because the client is sending it to the Traefik reverse proxy. Only Traefik will see the client's IP address, and it needs to forward it to the AdGuard Home server. Otherwise, AdGuard Home will just see the internal IP address of the Traefik container. Because this is a standard reverse proxy flag that is sent in the HTTP request, you need to enable this setting here, trusted proxy, so that the AdGuard Home server trusts the connection from the Traefik container. You can easily do this by just adding all of the Docker internal networks by using the 172.16.00/12 subnet masks. So this is like all of the Docker local internal networks. And then you can exit this container. You just need to restart your AdGuard Home server. So just do a Docker compose upd with force recreate, or stop the container, redeploy it. You can do it either way. And then when the container has restarted and we refresh the page, this setting here is enabled, and we don't need a certificate. All right. So now we can send DNS-over-HTTPS queries from our local device to the AdGuard Home server. I will just demonstrate how that would work. You would need to go in your operating system settings. I think Windows now supports DoH. I don't really know because I haven't used a Windows device in the last 2 or 3 years anymore, but I know it's there somewhere, and I hope macOS probably also does it. But you can also use a simple terminal command. I will use dogo. This is a modern Rust DNS troubleshooting tool. Of course, I will again use the Tinder example here. And the query you need to send is @https AdGuard Home and then /DNS query. You see that the response immediately comes back with 000. So that means the AdGuard Home receives it and answers it with a black hole response. And when we go back to the UI, you should also see in the query log blocked service tinder.com. So in comparison of the plain DNS query, you see that this is definitely working over the encrypted connection. And yeah, this is how that magic all works. You can, of course, test this with other pages. For example, christianlambert.de should immediately work because, yeah, that's fine. And you see this in the query log. All right, so next, the only thing that's left to do, configure a router, configure a DHCP server, send all the DNS queries to AdGuard Home. And for all the devices where you want to encrypt the connection inside your local network, configure DoH on the operating system of your device, or you can do it in the settings of your browser and configure the devices to send the DNS queries via DoH to the AdGuard's Home DNS name. And then you have completely encrypted DNS queries with a built-in ad and tracker blocking, parental controls, custom filtering, block lists. So yeah, this is really an amazing system. But yeah, that's it for today. I hope you liked this tutorial. I know it was a little detailed, but I think there are some important technologies that deserve to be covered in a lot of technical detail. So if you like these kind of videos, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for more technical tutorials. And please also tell me in the comments, what do you like more, Pi-hole, AdGuard Home, or maybe you like another service? I've also heard some people saying Blocky, so maybe that's yeah, a tutorial that I could do next year or so. And of course, if you haven't seen the Boilerplate CLI tool before, check this out, give this GitHub repo a star. By the way, if you encounter any issues or trouble, go to my Discord server. We have a friendly and open community there to get support or to raise suggestions for other Docker Compose templates I should add to this library. And as always, thank you so much for watching. A big thanks goes out to all of the supporters on my channel or on Patreon. You guys are really amazing. And of course, I will catch you in the next tutorial. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.